The wind wasn't blowing, it was howling. My sturdy research cabin rattled, feeling as fragile as a matchbox against nature's fury. Rain began to lash against the glass like bullets. I knew exactly what was coming. This lowland would soon become a deadly water trap. I was completely alone. No one could get in, and I couldn't get out. I was trying to reinforce a window when I heard it. Over the chaotic roar of the storm, a different sound cut through. Not a breaking branch. It was a faint, desperate scratching at my front door. It was followed by a whimper, the wretched sound of a creature on the edge of death. My heart seized. Something was out there. I know the rules of the wild. Never open your door at the peak of a storm, and absolutely never interfere with nature. But that cry, it pierced through the howling wind, too wretched, too desperate to ignore. It sounded less like an animal and more like the cry of a breaking soul. My hand trembled as I grabbed the heavy-duty flashlight. I cracked the door open an inch, ready to slam it shut if it was a leopard or a wild boar. The wind immediately tried to rip the door from my grasp, slapping stinging rain across my face. I aimed the beam of light onto the soaked porch. I froze. The air caught in my throat. It wasn't a cute antelope or a lost puppy. It was the wild's most brutal antagonist, a hyena. But the creature huddled before me was no monster. It was a trembling bag of bones, its spotted fur matted tight against its heaving ribs. It was emaciated, as if it had been starved for weeks. One of its hind legs was horribly injured, twisted at a gruesome angle, with fresh blood mixing with the pooling rainwater. It slowly lifted its head, every movement an act of torture. The flashlight caught its eyes. I had braced myself for wild aggression, the cold stare of a killer. But instead, I saw raw terror. Its large, dark eyes were wide, glistening with moisture, holding a silent, soul-crushingly deep plea. It wasn't looking at me like prey. It was looking at me like a last resort. It was begging for its life. It made another sound, a guttural, choked whimper that sounded so much like a human sob it shattered my heart. It was shivering violently, powerful convulsions racking its small frame, not just from the bone-chilling cold, but from utter exhaustion and fear. It was an outcast, abandoned by its own, dying on my doorstep. Logic screamed at me to close the door. Survival instinct told me this was madness. But looking deep into those miserable, human-like eyes, I knew I couldn't let it drown in the rising mud. Leaving it there was a death sentence. I made a decision that defied all reason. I swung the door wide open. I lunged out into the downpour. The storm hit me like a physical blow. The wind nearly knocked me off the slick porch. The hyena tried to get up, but its leg buckled, sending it sprawling in the mud. I bent down, ignoring my soaked clothes. The stench of the wild, of blood and earth, filled my nostrils. I had to grab it by the scruff of its neck, but it was heavier than I thought. "Come on, get inside," I grunted, my voice barely audible over the storm. It whimpered, a faint sound swallowed by the wind. With every ounce of my strength, I used my body as leverage, shoving the animal inside. The second it was over the threshold, a monstrous gust of wind hit, as if the wild wanted its victim back. I threw my full body weight against the heavy door, slamming it shut. The lock clicked with a deafening finality. We were safe. But that relief lasted less than a second. Crack! A bolt of lightning struck the nearby transformer with an ear-splitting explosion. The ground shook. The lights in the cabin blinked out. Absolute darkness swallowed us. The silence was deafening. All I could hear was my own ragged breathing and the animal's whimpers. I fumbled for the flashlight on the table. Grrr. A low, menacing growl rumbled from the corner of the room. It wasn't a weak whimper anymore. It was the warning of a predator. I flicked on the flashlight. The fractured beam illuminated a scene of pure horror. The hyena was trying to stand. It was in a full-blown panic. Its broken leg was useless, but it used its 3 good legs to balance, its body trembling violently. Its head was low, its white teeth bared, saliva dripping from its jaws. Its eyes, which moments ago held a plea, now reflected the flashlight as two hostile green orbs. It didn't recognize me as its rescuer. In this chaotic darkness, I was just another threat, an enemy to be destroyed. My heart hammered against my ribs. I was trapped in a tiny room with a wild animal going mad with pain and fear. It backed up, bumping into the wooden wall. I heard the scrape of its claws on the floorboards. It was looking for an escape. "Easy now," I said, my voice a low tremor. It let out a louder guttural snarl. It took one step toward me. I couldn't run. The back door was bolted. I couldn't fight. It could tear out my throat with a single bite. I remembered what I'd learned: never show fear, never run. I had to be dominant, but not threatening. I slowly lowered myself, sitting down on the cold floor. I switched off the flashlight. Darkness returned, but this time it felt less like a threat and more like a veil. Only the flickering lightning from outside provided any light, casting monstrous shadows on the walls. I could hear the hyena's ragged, panicked breathing in the corner. I started to speak, not to command, but to soothe. "It's okay, I know you're scared. I am too." My voice was a steady, almost whisper, a quiet rhythm against the storm. "We're safe in here. The storm will pass." I kept repeating the words, a calming mantra in the chaos. Silence. Just the drumming of rain on the roof. The growling stopped. Its ears twitched. In the dark, I saw its silhouette tilt its head, listening to my voice. In a surreal moment between flashes of lightning, I saw its tense muscles relax. It let out a long, shuddering breath. And then, it did the impossible. It slowly lay back down on the wooden floor, but this time, it didn't turn its back to defend itself. It lay facing me, just a few feet away. Its breathing was still labored, but it had accepted my presence. We sat there in the dark, two lonely outcasts, listening to each other breathe through the storm. It hadn't attacked me, and I hadn't run. We had survived the worst moment, together. The last of the wind's howls faded to a weak moan just before dawn. The ensuing silence was almost more deafening than the noise had been. The gray morning light filtered through the rain-streaked windows, illuminating the battlefield in my living room. Mud, blood, and soaked towels. The hyena hadn't moved from its spot near the door. In the unforgiving light of day, its condition was horrific. It wasn't just a broken leg, its entire flank was ravaged. The hind leg was swollen to twice its normal size, covered in deep, festering wounds that were beginning to ooze pus. The thick, cloying smell of infection overpowered the scent of wet fur. I recognized the marks. They weren't the claws of a lion or the horns of a buffalo from a fight for survival. They were teeth marks, sharp, brutal, from its own kind. This wasn't an accident, it was an execution. Its pack had turned on it, savaged it, and left it for the coming storm. My heart broke all over again for this creature. It wasn't a monster, it was the victim of a brutal social exile. It had dragged itself to my door last night, not just for shelter from the rain, but for refuge from its own world. Leaving it like this was a death sentence. The infection would kill it in days, a slow, agonizing death. I made a choice that went against every remaining instinct of self-preservation. I went to my cabinet and pulled out my field trauma kit. I had to clean those wounds. I approached slowly, kneeling a few feet away. The hyena watched me. Its eyes, no longer glowing a panicked green in the dark, were now a soft, muddy brown. They were clouded with a pain and exhaustion so profound it looked like indifference. It didn't growl, it didn't try to drag itself away. It just watched me with a heartbreaking resignation, as if waiting for the final blow. I held out a trembling hand. "It's okay," I whispered, the words feeling impossibly small. Gently, I placed my hand on its flank. It flinched violently, muscles spasming under my touch, but it didn't bite. Its skin was hot with fever. This was the moment of truth. I soaked a gauze pad with antiseptic. I took a deep breath and pressed the pad into the worst of the bites. The reaction was immediate. The hyena threw its head back and let out a sound I will never forget. a high-pitched, agonizing scream of pain that vibrated through the floorboards. Its jaws snapped open, razor-sharp canines inches from my face. I tensed, waiting for the bite that would tear my arm apart. But the bite never came. It stopped mid-air. Its whole body trembled, fighting the instinct to defend itself against the sudden pain. It slowly turned its massive head toward me. We locked eyes. In that split second, something miraculous happened. The wild panic in its eyes receded, replaced by a shocking flicker of understanding. It seemed to be assessing me, weighing the pain I was inflicting against the calm in my voice. It understood. It understood that this pain was different, that it was the pain of healing, not of harm. It let out a shaky breath and laid its head back down on its paws, whimpering softly, surrendering completely to my care. I worked quickly, cleaning out the dirt and pus, stitching the worst of the gashes, and splinting the leg with clean bandages. When I finally sat back, covered in sweat and grime, the transformation was incredible. Not physically, it was still a wreck, but emotionally. The tension that had held its body rigid for hours had melted away. Its breathing deepened into a rhythmic sleep. For the first time since its arrival, it looked peaceful. It had survived the darkness, the pack, and the storm. I looked at this brave, broken survivor sleeping on my rug. Storm, I whispered. It was the only name that fit. The next 3 days passed in a strange, quiet rhythm between Storm and me. The wild creature's recovery was astonishingly fast. It accepted the food I offered, slept on the old rug in the corner, and I watched the light of life, wild, proud, and resilient, slowly return to its amber-colored eyes. We existed in a silent agreement. It never became tame. It maintained a safe distance, ever watchful. But the raw terror of the storm had been replaced by a cautious respect. I knew our time was running out. The wild was calling it home. On the afternoon of the 4th day, as the golden post-storm sun cast a honey-colored glow on the drenched forest, it stood up. It tested its bandaged leg, then limped to the edge of the porch. Its nose twitched, taking in the air, its ears swiveling to sounds I couldn't hear. I opened the screen door. It stepped out, pausing for a second on the threshold between my world and its own. It didn't look back at me with human-like gratitude. The wild has no room for sentimentality. It simply moved on. I watched its determined, limping gait disappear into the dense undergrowth. I stood there long after it had become just a shadow, then vanished completely into the golden haze of dusk. The cabin suddenly felt painfully empty. People call hyenas cruel, the villains of the wild, but in the darkest, most desperate night of its life, cast out by its own, that creature chose to trust a stranger. And when I was faced with my own primal fear in the dark, I learned that calm is more powerful than violence. Sometimes the biggest storms aren't wind and rain, but loneliness and prejudice. That night, 2 lonely outcasts on the edge of existence, one human, one animal, found each other in the eye of the storm. We leaned on each other to survive. It reminded me that even in the most hardened of exteriors, there is a fierce will to live, to be seen, and to connect. If Storm's story of courage touched your heart, please share this video to spread the message that every life deserves a second chance. And don't forget to subscribe to continue this journey with me, finding the forgotten miracles of the wild.